Introducing myself, as Pete says, I wrote Workers Can Win. I've been a workplace activist for an embarrassingly long time. Led a number of strikes mainly in the private sector, but the last few years I've had my first public sector job working at Transport for Greater Manchester, where I was on the picket line this morning, actually, despite having left there a few weeks ago. And I'm also one of the coordinators of Troublemakers at Work, which is a network of workplace activists. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. So quite useful to just think about when we talk about the term working class, who do we mean? Because it's one of those phrases that's used to mean lots of different things by different people. So I think if you were to listen to the media, a lot of the time the definitions are based on education or income or what people's accent is or what they like to drink or what wear or those kind of things. So it's very much cultural things. And there's also this stereotype, isn't there, of the working class being these straight white cis male manual workers, as those are the only people who are the real working class. But you also hear people using a slightly more Marxist notion that the working class is wage labourers, so people who are working for a wage. And I'm going to try and unpick that a little bit. And it's worth remembering that this doesn't map on to kind of how like impoverished people are. So there's lots of self-employed people, for example, who are worse off than a great many employees, some of whom are on good pay. Many managers, including quite senior managers in large organizations, are also legally employees working for a wage, but their social position, I would argue, is quite different from the rest of us. So for me, wage labour doesn't quite cut it as a definition. For Marxists, class is about a relationship. So classes are large groups of people with conflicting interests. So in different eras, we could talk about peasants and lords or slaves and masters, or these days, workers and bosses. So that's why I would say if you're self-employed and don't have a boss, that's, you're not part of that working class in that sense, even if you're very hard up and doing tough work or whatever. And I'd also think it's worth noting that the working class is constantly being remade. So one of the features of capitalism is that industries and occupations get destroyed, transformed, created all the time. So anybody's image of what the working class is continually being made out of date. So if people think of the early 20th century and they think of the kind of stereotypical worker, you'd probably think of a miner, for example. But actually, there were more domestic servants than miners at the start of the 20th century. So quite often our stereotypes are wrong as well of what the working class was in the past. So at the bottom, I've put my own like working definition. So it includes some of the kind of stuff about wage labourers, people who must sell their labour power to live. Must is important there. So some people who don't need to choose to. But also the working class includes those out of work, their dependents, people who are too young, old, sick, or busy with caring for other working class people to do paid work. So that's a sense that the working class is more than those of us who happen to be in paid work at any one moment in time. It's the people who will be, wish they were, can't be for various reasons, and looking after people who will be or have been. But also, I would argue the working class does not include those who are employed primarily to manage other workers. So in other words, they're being paid to manage the exploitation of other workers. They're acting on behalf of the bosses rather than the workers. So I'm just going to pause there because I've said a load of contentious things there, and I wonder what people think. So I think there's a big spectrum of managers, right? So these days, particularly in large organizations, if there's a high turnover, particularly anybody who's been there more than 6 months probably has manager in their job title, and often they're on like a few pence more an hour than the people they're managing. That isn't what I mean by a manager when I'm talking about them not being part of the working class. Those people are, they're primarily being employed to work, and they happen to be supervising some other people at the same time. At the other extreme, you've got people, a lot of company directors or just below that might actually be technically employees. But clearly they're acting as bosses, right? And then you've got a layer in between, who I think middle class is a really good term for, where they're neither one nor the other. And yeah, I think in practice, you often see them pulled this way and that. They, in some cases, have come out of the workforce and still might have mates who, in the main body of the workforce. They might identify with them, but they're under pressure from above. They've got a privileged position that they risk losing if they don't do the bidding of the boss. So, they get pulled this way and that. And so I think middle class is a good description for those people. Yeah, I mean, I certainly don't claim to be an expert, but I don't think that term has anything to do with their views, right? So I think Marx also used the term reserve armies of labour. So there's parts of the population who aren't in regular work, but who are available, when as and when the capitalists think it's profitable to employ them, and get drawn into the workforce, often temporarily on very bad terms and conditions, and then spat back out again the moment times get tough. And my understanding is when Marx is using the term lumpen proletariat, it's referring to those people sort of somewhere between the poorest end of the working class and absolute destitution. And that experience politically often making people quite volatile. So not necessarily, as you say, having reactionary views. There might be very radical left or radical right, but desperation can drive people to take quite extreme views at times. Yeah, and that industry is actually bigger now than TV, the movies put together. It's absolutely enormous as an industry. I mean, I think politically it's important because I think if you live in a country like Britain, I think politically we have a responsibility to try to tackle the complicity of our government in genocide and imperialism and all the rest of it. And if you're in a colonized country, you have the added complexity that your ruling class probably tries to exploit you while blaming imperialist powers for putting them in a position where they kind of have no choice and limiting their room for maneuver. So I do think the political dimensions are quite different. I mean, and it definitely is beyond the scope of tonight's meeting, but I think there's quite a widespread assumption, I think, on parts of the left that workers in a country like Britain are somehow kind of bought off by that imperialist relationship Britain has with much of the world. I personally don't buy that because I don't think bosses employ people unless they can extract value out of them, right? So I still think it's that exploitative relationship, even if our lives might be a lot more comfortable than in many poorer countries, and our productivity in many cases is much higher because of the level of capital investment that surrounds our work. But yeah, probably a bit beyond the scope. But yeah, good point. I'm going to move on, if that's okay, to kind of why the working class has been a focus so much for Marxists. And I think there are quite a few factors. There's the fact that it's a class that objectively has an interest in ending capitalist exploitation and oppression, because we're on the receiving end of it, aren't we? It's not good for us. But it's not just that. I mean, there are other classes who are, globally the peasantry, which, doesn't exist in Britain anymore, but clearly treated abominably, doesn't have an interest in the status quo, but a different relationship to capitalist society um, uh, uh, than the working class. But it's also about potential power, the ability of workers to disrupt society and the production of profit, which is the motor of a capitalist society. Um, the very nature of work. I mean, anytime you look at a job advert, it's quite rare to find one that doesn't ask for you to be a good team worker, right? So that reflects the fact that even jobs that on the face of it look quite individualized actually do usually almost always require some level of collaboration between workers to achieve the employer's objectives. So they're training us day in, day out to collaborate and act collectively, and so on. So I would argue that and the fact that if we were to take over that production process, it wouldn't make sense for most workers to kind of take their bit of the workplace home with them and they would own it or something. We could only imagine taking control of that production in a collective way. So I think it creates a bias towards democracy, towards collective action and collective solutions, which I think is quite important if we're interested in changing the world. There's obviously a lot of us. And I think the process of struggle and the process of work is part of how we kind of learn how to democratically run society, including work. Because if we're going to have a different sort of society that's genuinely democratic and free, the idea that we'd be free, except between 9 and 5 to, use the stereotype of work, is just a joke, isn't it? That's a huge part of people's lives. So we have to tackle that area of oppression and exploitation. But the working class is obviously divided in various ways. Nationalities we've just talked about, but also race and class and race and gender and disability and sexuality and so on. And in reality, lots of struggles don't align neatly with class divisions. So, many of the biggest struggles we've seen in recent years, Black Lives Matter or the Me Too stuff, or we could think about the Palestinian struggle, aren't on strictly class lines, right? They interact with class because oppression is often a way that people experience class. It's very different to be a woman if you're a working class woman to being a ruling class woman, and similarly if you're in an oppressed nation, the situation is very different. So it's always been the view of Marxists going back a long way that to win, the working class needs alliances with other groups. So if we looked back to the 19th century or the early 20th century, the peasantry was a key group that Marxists sought to see alliances with. And it's interesting, people these days often just go back to Marx and talk workers of the world unite, and they forget that Lenin updated this, more than 100 years ago and said workers of the world and oppressed peoples unite. And I think that seems to me to be much closer to the kind of view we need now, where anti-oppression struggles are so much more central to struggle today than they were even 100 years ago. So then, having talked about the working class, so how does class struggle and workplace struggle? What's the relationship between the two? Because I think often on the left, people kind of reduce class struggle to being workplace struggle, to struggle purely over jobs, pay and conditions, as Sharon Graham would have it. But that isn't the case at all. Class struggle can be individual, it can be collective, it can be inside work, it can be outside work, it can be over absolutely any issue. And I would argue that even if you think about workplace struggles, they are nearly always about what in the jargon we could call about the quality of social reproduction, which is, the quality of our ability to make a life. So if people are fighting over pay, it's not because they want money in the abstract, it's they want money to have a better life outside work. They're fighting to have shorter hours so they can have a better life outside work. Even those, very old-fashioned economistic struggles, never mind the ones about the behavior of the boss, that might cause stress and ruin your mental health. They're all actually about our quality of life, aren't they? They're not really just economic struggles. So even if we talk about workplace struggle, we shouldn't think of it in that narrow way. But I would argue that we are at our strongest when we unite struggles in the workplace and our communities rather than counterposing them. So I guess a really good example is some of you might remember the strike at the Marikana mine in South Africa some years back, where there was a horrible massacre of the miners. And when they were organising for that strike, one of the first things they found was that when they'd been winning higher wages, they were all living in accommodation controlled by by the boss, and then miraculously the rent went up. So their pay rise was futile unless they also thought about housing. And that's a story that I think you see replicated in countries like Britain as well, where while housing costs are going up, we're like running up the down escalator trying to improve, hold on to our standard of living unless we're tackling issues outside the workplace as well. So getting that unity is where we're strongest. But I would argue that struggle at work is particularly important. I'm not saying it's the only important terrain of struggle, but I do think it's an important one because the process of work, that employment relationship itself, causes conflict and shapes resistance. And what I mean by that is that when you go to work, typically you are paid to be there for a number of hours. Um, and then somebody is paid to try and get as much work out of you as possible in that time. They're called a manager, right? The only reason managers are there is because there's kind of flexibility in how hard you work and how well you work, isn't there, while you're at work? And they're trying to get as much out of you as possible for as little as possible. And of course, because work is constantly changing, the technology is changing, work processes are changing, the economic context is changing. They are continually finding new ways to try to squeeze a bit more out of us. And for that matter, we're trying to find new ways to get a bit more out of them. So that whole employment relationship causes conflict. It's not about bad managers or troublesome union reps or whatever. It's inherent to the employment relationship, and that is quite an important factor in capitalist society. And I think the nature of people's work then shapes what sort of resistance they take, and we'll maybe come on to that a bit more later. But as I touched on before, it usually creates collective relationships between workers, helping build power and democracy. There's a notion that the American organizer and writer Jane McAlevey popularized, which is the idea that you have two types of organizing, structure-based and self-selecting organizing. And her idea, like self-selecting organizing, is where people who already agree with you find you and join in with the thing you're doing. So you might stand on the street with a stall. The only people you talk to are the people who like your poster or agree with your leaflet or what you're shouting or however it is you're engaging with people. Whereas if you're organizing at work, you're trying to systematically talk to every worker and you're trying to win over all of the people within that structure that's not defined by people's political allegiances. It's just defined by who they happen to be employed by. And you could have a similar example with some of the tenant struggles where people do door knocking around a particular estate, for example, to try to do structure-based organizing in the same way. But Jane argued that structure-based organising has much more potential for building majorities. So rather than just finding the minority who already agree with you and are motivated to take part, you're trying to win over everybody and get much higher participation. And if you can get majorities, even if it's in a relatively small group, that is much more powerful than a kind of dispersed scattering of people across society. Organising at work is also much more resilient to repression than most types of organising. It is really difficult for bosses to stop us talking to each other, given that in most jobs they require us to talk to each other in order to get the job done. So it's really hard for them to completely police that, even with new technology. And of course, the same applies with physical repression as well. So again, another South African example, but a bit earlier, when there were these states of emergency under apartheid, the government would send armored vehicles in to shoot up people in the townships who were having an uprising, whatever. But actually destroying their own factories and mines was not an attractive prospect because they would be destroying their own capital. So the fact that you're working with capital belonging to the enemy gives you some degree of protection against repression in that way as well. So we've often seen that in really repressive societies, people can still at some level organize at work. And finally, there's the disruptive potential that we talked about before. I mean, I'd agree with that, that usually your first step is to try to find some allies, and that is not structure based. That is, find who you can. How you do that would depend on the context. It might be that you get some friendly person to come and leaflet outside. It might be that you do a campaign about something that's not at all work related and therefore isn't a threat to the boss. So you try and get people to go on some demo about something non-work related, or you talk about a political issue, whatever, and try and see who seems interested in that. It's going to vary, I think, from situation to situation how you find those first allies, but you have to find some little group of people where you can build some trust. Sometimes I think it's just people who happen to socialize together from a workplace, who, build some bonds of trust and decide together that they want to do something, or a particular work group. So it's going to depend, I think, how you get started on that. But finding allies is absolutely critical first step. And I completely agree that isn't structure based. But I guess the point, and by the way, I'm not saying there's no point doing self-selecting organising. It has its place, right? There are some types of campaigning where it's quite well suited. But I think Jane's insight was that you want to go from that where you can to trying to use what you've built in that way to do some structure-based organising, build more power, which sounds like the Village Hotel people have done a good job on. I think it's worth saying that the officers dealing with hospitality in quite a few areas are at the more radical end of the spectrum of Unite officers, so a bit more supportive of a bottom-up approach than most, I think. Okay, I shall move on. I mean, clearly we've got a massive need to organise, whether we talk about in work or not. I mean, we should remember just how significant it is. We've still got, despite all the defeats, through the 80s and 90s and the kind of stagnation since, there's still over 6 million union members in the UK. And that's quite a big commitment. I mean, most of those people are paying somewhere between £100 and £200 a year to be members. That's quite a big deal. That's, more than are in any of the churches or political parties by a country mile, isn't it? So, we shouldn't understate it, but that still leaves about 24 million employees who are not in the union. So we've got a job to do. The other factor is that they're very concentrated in, like, half of those are in the public sector, and much of the rest is in the former public services that have been privatised. But there are pockets elsewhere in bits of manufacturing in particular, but that's where the vast bulk of membership is. And even where you've got union organisation, it's been what I would describe as hollowed out. And what I mean by that is that you might formally have union membership, but union recognition. The employer might say, yeah, we agree, we have to talk to the union, but often the membership is not as high as it should be. Often there aren't that many reps, or the reps aren't that active. And they're often only really bargaining over what in the jargon is called contractual relations. So maybe an annual pay deal, maybe if there's some job losses, those kind of issues. So it's what I call once a year trade unionism. And I'd contrast that with how Royal Mail was until the defeat of their last strike, which was much more what I'd call everyday trade unionism, where pretty much anything that happened in the workplace, workers would discuss it, reps would try and bargain over it. And so that was reflected whenever they had industrial action ballots. Most unions really struggled to get a good turnout in large bargaining units with hundreds of thousands of people. So if you look at local authorities or health or higher education, that's been quite a challenge. But the CWU would just sail through those ballots because they had that level of activity and engagement on a day-to-day basis at workplace level. So that's one real weakness, even where we do have union organisation. And then secondly, a lot of them are really infected with partnerships. So this is the idea, and I think Grangemouth probably reflects this to some extent, that we have a shared interest with the employer. And, if they're really successful, some of that will trickle down to us. And it is absolutely poisonous for any organizing, because what ends up happening is you're in a situation where you need to fight, but you're more afraid of hurting your enemy than you are of getting hurt yourself. And I think you see this in lots of different campaigns and disputes. Another weakness, which I've not put on the slide, is that much of the time unions adopt what's called in the jargon a servicing approach, which means that they're, trying to sell membership like it was an insurance policy or the AA or something, where some third party will come to your rescue when you have a problem, rather than it being about collective organisation and collective action of workers themselves. So we've got that need, and we've got a real urgency because of the problems we're facing in society. So a lot of people who feel very strongly about Palestine or climate or whatever feel that attempts to organise at work are just too slow. But I would argue that despite the fact that it's not going to produce like overnight results in most cases, it's still better to do that than waste our time on strategies that lack any sort of power or interest analysis and don't have a way of winning. And part of the reason that still gives me hope, I mean, last night I was at a meeting with Andreas Malm talking about his new book on climate, and somebody asked a question about, do you have any hope? And it really struck me how he's trying to find hope, but he does this analysis of why the climate crisis is so tied up with capitalism, and you can't really fix the climate crisis within a capitalist framework. But at the same time, he doesn't believe we can get rid of capitalism. So he's then left saying, "Oh, so we have to do something else," and he's kind of scratching around. And I think he also said, but he didn't seem to connect the two, that you get these explosions of struggle. I mean, he referred to the tremendous dockers action and general strike in Italy over Palestine, which very few people saw coming. And that is always the pattern, that revolutions and huge upsurges and struggle don't come incrementally. But the work we do now paves the way for them. It increases their chances of success when they happen. So that patient work now, I would argue, is really important. But we shouldn't kid ourselves that we're going to kind of get to the revolution one step at a time. It just doesn't work like that. So we don't make those explosions, but it's the best preparation we can have. No, so I mean, there's quite a lot in that. So yeah, brilliant example from the early 70s of the Pentonville dockers being jailed and being sprung out of jail by mass strikes, unofficial strikes. And you're absolutely right. It actually went on all the way through the 80s and into the early 90s, that the majority of strikes were unofficial, which means they weren't called by unions. Workers just decided, we've had enough, we're out of here. Right. So it took the Tories until the 90s to actually put a lid on that. Years after the defeat of the miners, that was still the case. I think quite a lot of people commenting on that era of defeat for us put too much emphasis on the law, right? So the Tories did use the law, but they tended only to use the law when we were already on the back foot. I think the decisive changes were in so the high point of union membership was actually 1979, the same year that Thatcher got elected, when it hit 13 million. And one of the first things that she did was put up interest rates to cause mass unemployment, deliberately causing mass unemployment, knowing that this would weaken workers, make workers more scared, driving lots of firms out of business, and leading to huge layoffs. And I think that was the biggest single factor in that wave of defeats, much more than the legislation. But you also had what had come before that, which was a Labour government that had done deals with the union bureaucracy to try and hold down pay when inflation was high. And union officials, including some on the left, had encouraged workers to scab on each other in order to maintain that social contract with the Labour government. And they had broken a tradition of solidarity that had been built up over decades, hard fought for by workers. So, yeah, I think I think the law played a part, but I do think it gets exaggerated a little bit. But what the law definitely does do is it makes it harder to rebuild. So having gone through years of low levels of strikes, it puts all kinds of barriers in the way of people trying to organise now. So people have to be a lot more creative. But I don't think we're going to kind of get like a mass strike over 0 hours contracts kind of out of nothing. I think if you look at where we've come closest to solidarity action, it's where people are already taking action. So we could think back to the climate strikes a few years ago, where school kids started off taking action, and then um, people moved motions through the TUC for a day of action for workers, which meant nothing because the TUC never does anything like that. But some workplaces, people did manage to get walkouts as part of that and try to push that further. So that it seems to me that's the kind of dynamic we need to be looking for. How do we do the things we can do, the little first steps? So where there's industrial action, can we get different strikes to coordinate so they're on strike on the same day? This morning, a group of us from the CFGM strike went down the road to a UCU college workers that were on strike, and that they came and spoke at our rally as well. So things like that just build that solidarity. It's baby steps, I'm afraid, most of the time at the moment. So we've been bandying the word organising around, and it's one of those words like socialism and Christianity that people use to mean almost anything. So I did think it was worth just saying what I mean by it. And I mean systematically trying to build workers' collective power. And by power, I mean the ability to get what we want, even when people try and stop us. And in a work context, I just want to make really clear, I am not just talking about union membership. There's work. Probably all of you know of workplaces where there's quite a lot of people who filled in a union membership form, but people don't stick together and they get walked all over by management. There are rarer, but equally there are examples of workplaces and groups of workers who aren't union members, but who do stick together and who behave more like a trade union than those people who filled the direct debit forms in. So a few years ago, just up the road from me in Bury, there was a food factory. It was overwhelmingly Eastern European migrant workers, no union there at all. They managed to have a walkout for, I think it's 2.5 days. They won some concessions. Me and a comrade who's a Polish speaker went up there afterwards to have a chat with some of them. And quite a lot of them still didn't know what a union was, right? But they knew how to go on strike. They'd worked that out for themselves, right? And that's what I'm talking about as organising, not the direct debit forms. I mean, union membership matters, but it's not that. And it's about power relying on workers' own collective action, not somebody else coming to our rescue, whether that's union officials, celebrities, lawyers, the media, politicians, whatever. And at the heart of our power is participation, right? If we haven't got high participation from people, we haven't got the power. So it's all about building capacity. That's not just about numbers. That's about skills, knowledge, experience, ideas, confidence, networks. And to do that, that means, and this comes back to this idea of structure-based organising, not just talking to the people who already agree with us and already convinced, about going beyond that if we're talking seriously about organising. Does that make sense? Okey-doke. So I think to do that, you need some mixture of ideas and technique. I don't think the ideas that you need are that complicated, really, but I think it's worth just saying what some of them are. So I think you have to have that commitment to workers advancing their own interest through their own collective activity, not doing things for people. I think it's really helpful to have a belief that workers generally make wise choices when they've got big decisions and good information. That isn't about having rose-tinted spectacles. I'm sure, like me, you've worked with some absolute idiots who've done some really stupid things. But when the big stuff comes up, if people have got a sensible, plan of how they could win something, usually people are up for it. And if people can see something's a really, really bad idea that's high risk, usually people are very reluctant to do that equally. So it helps to trust workers over those kind of big decisions. You're not trying to manipulate them in any way. I think it really helps to have an understanding of power, what types of power workers have got, and maybe we can come on to that as well. and an understanding of the role of unions and their limitations. So I think when a lot of people start trying to organise at work, their knowledge of trade unionism comes from the BBC or the Daily Mail, and it comes as a little bit of a shock to them that in fact those union officials aren't trying to make them go out on strike against their will at every opportunity, which is what you'd think from from the news. And then there's a bunch of technique, which I won't run through. Obviously, this is a meeting, not a training session, but I do think some of the skills of how to do it are important too. So a little bit more about power. I don't think we talk about power anywhere near enough. I think it's great if you can get workers to think and discuss what sorts of potential power they've got. I've come up with this model, which is adapted from a brilliant book by a woman called Beverly Silver called Forces of Labour, which covers patterns of industrial action over like 200 or 300 years. It's an amazing book. But basically is to think about the sorts of power that different groups of workers have got in different quantities. So structural power coming from workers' position in the production process or wider society. So a couple of examples would be when the auto industry started up and they started using production lines, workers quite quickly realized that a small group of workers sitting down at one point on the production line could stop the whole thing, right? So because of the production process and where they were located on it, they could have a big impact quite quickly. You could think of, whenever there's dock strikes, it's really obvious that they are like a pinch point for the economy. But I think it's quite important we think about some of the other examples that maybe don't leap to mind quite so much. I think COVID showed the kind of structural power of primary school teachers. That when they weren't in work or if the schools were closed, half the rest of the economy had to stop because everybody else was at home looking after the kids. And sometimes, I think there's a tendency to just think of quite kind of traditional male-dominated industries when we think about structural power. And I'm just really making a point that we need to think a little bit wider than that. Does that make sense? Market power is about position in the labour market. So how replaceable are we? So a good example of that would be where I used to work. We had one group of workers who were like really niche technical skills working on a product that only their employer produced, couldn't replace them from anywhere else. Many of them had got 20 or 30 years experience working on it, pretty much unsackable really. But the problem is they worked on projects that took months or even years to finish. And if they took any action, frankly, nobody noticed for quite a long time. But we also had people working in a call center who felt very sackable because it took a few weeks to train people up to not do a good job, but do an adequate job to replace them. Much lower paid typically, and feeling very vulnerable. But actually, if they took action, if the phone didn't get answered within a certain number of rings, the employer would get penalties from the customers, financial penalties. So actually having those two groups of workers taking action together was really powerful because the different sorts of power that they had combined so that the very techie workers knew that the action was having an impact because the call center workers were out. The call center workers knew that they were almost unsackable because they were out with these really techie workers. So it was quite a good example that I thought. But you can also think about it. One of the other things the Tories did in the 1980s was start really big attacks on the welfare benefits. So trying to scare workers that if you aren't in work, you'll really not be able to pay the bills, you won't be able to get by. So that's undermining workers' market power, our access to a safety net of any kind. Associational power, that's about collective organisation. People always think of unions, but it's not just that. It could be in the community, it could be political campaigns and parties, all kinds of different organisations. Slightly, I think, less important one, institutional power. Lots of employers do sign up to code, ethical codes for a bit of greenwashing or whatever. And sometimes you can put a bit of pressure on them through some of those standards or legal enforcement if they're breaking the law in a way that's enforceable. And finally, ideological power. For me, I think this works in a slightly different way. I'm not suggesting suggesting that the employer is going to cave in because we have a really good argument. That doesn't seem to work. But I think workers are really reluctant to do anything if they don't think it's right. So, if we all just acted in our own self-interest, we'd fight all the time, wouldn't we? Because we're being exploited all the time. But actually, workers need to believe that and you look how much effort is put into telling us that you're undermining society by taking action, you're greedy, you're selfish, you're pushing up inflation, you're undercutting public services, all the arguments that are used to tell us that us standing up for ourselves are wrong. That should tell us that this is important, right? That the employers and the government and the media are spending so much effort trying to tell us it's not right to fight. So the point I'm trying to make is that different groups of workers will have different mixes of these types of potential power. So picking up Grangemouth again, when we were about to have our first national strike when I was in the IT industry, I put together a training event for reps from all around the country. And we got a guest speaker who was the convener from Grangemouth, and they'd just had a successful dispute over a similar issue. And he was chatting to people and said, well, it was easy for us. We had an oil refinery to play with. And everybody laughed, but everybody knew exactly what he meant, that the power was obvious to the workers, that if they cut off the fuel supply to Scotland, that would create a crisis and so on. But actually, another example we talked about was about supermarket checkout staff, and they're in the opposite position to those production line workers I talked about, aren't they? So rather than being linear production line, checkout staff are working in parallel. So if I stop my till and you all carry on working, nobody really notices. It's very, very little impact. So to have impact, you need a lot more associational power to have impact if you're in that kind of work system. But those checkout staff typically aren't aware of the potential power they've got, are they? So it's not as obvious that you've got millions of pounds of perishable goods going through the tills, and that if you only stuck together, you could actually have a really powerful impact. It's not obvious that in the same way, I think, as for the oil refinery workers. And that brings me on to the difference between potential power, which is what all of this is, and actual power. Because if we're not aware of our potential power, it's no use to us, right? So this is why I think getting workers to talk about what power they've got is really, really important. Then we need the organisation to wield it. Unless those checkout staff are organised, that power can't have any impact. And finally, we have to have the political will to use it. If our union is USDOR and it's in partnership with our employer, and it's saying we don't agree with action, we're going to decide to accept the offer without even balloting members over it, then we've got a problem. So those are areas we need to work on if we're trying to organise, is that awareness, the organisation and the political will. Yeah, so I think there's quite a lot of jobs where people are quite committed to the work they're doing, and for that reason don't want to take action. And I think where you're trying to organise in that context, you have to take that head on. And the more that you can connect your objectives as workers to the to the needs of the service users, the better. So a couple of disputes we've had in Manchester in the last 20 years have involved mental health workers in the NHS. One of them was quite a long strike by mental health nurses, and they were asked by the press, but won't this harm the service users, many of whom were, in a really desperate position? And they said, yes, it will. We have to be honest about this. This action will harm them. But if we don't take this action, cuts and fragmentation of the service will continue, and they'll be getting harmed every day for years and years and years. So, even though it hurts us to do this and it hurts them to do this, we have to do this. Some of the US teachers adopted the slogan, our teaching conditions are the students' learning conditions, to try to make that connection. The more recent mental health strike we had in Manchester was by a group working with early intervention for psychosis. and their main demand, which they won, was additional staff. So again, even though it has definitely impacted on service users, they got massive support from service users during their disputes, and they were the result has been an increase in staff, which has clearly improved things very much um, for the service users as well. I mean, my general rule of thumb is everybody should organise where they are, right? Because, uh, well, if we're going to win a different society, it's going to involve people like the people we work with, right? So if we kind of give up on them before we've started, we're not going to win, right? It might be that where we're working isn't particularly fruitful, and you don't get very far because it's quite hard, right? That's the reality. Um, it's uneven. I do think it would be good if, as a left, we could identify some particular targets and try and support particular groups of workers to organise. There's a campaign going on at the moment that Organise Now are doing with the Bakers Union to organise staff at Gales bakeries. I don't know if they've reached as far as Scotland. They're mainly in the south. I know that they've just about reached the centre of Manchester. They haven't got as far north as North Manchester, where I live. But yeah, there's attempts to do things like that. I think are good. I kind of slightly balk at the idea we should simply do it based on how mistreated workers are, because I'm a big fan of winning. And I think if we can identify workers where they've got particular power, that's another reason you might want to choose them. We could have a big debate about where we should prioritize. And because I think when workers start winning and it becomes visible, that inspires other people to have a go. But that can be done from a powerful group of workers or a very badly treated group of workers. Both of those can work. So I remember a few years ago, there was a wave of strikes in McDonald's, and the number of people I heard say, well, if they can do it, right? So there's a thing like, if McDonald's workers could go on strike, what the hell's our excuse? So that can be effective. I'm not saying it can't be, but it is really hard to sustain organization in those kind of workplaces with very high turnover. So I don't think that action built any lasting power, really. Whereas I think there's been some less glamorous bits of organizing that have built some lasting power. People who've, built sustainable union organization. And again, it comes back to the different sorts of power. I think if you're working in fast food, to have much power, you are probably going to have to organize either a high proportion of the branches of a particular chain, or possibly a high proportion of the branches of a variety of chains in a particular geographical area, to have a significant bite when you take action. Because those workers are relatively replaceable, and the branches are there's loads of branches of different chains around, aren't there? So yeah, difficult discussions to have, but I think we should be having. I mentioned one of the things we should think about is unions and their limitations. There's loads of stuff you can do without a union. You can go on strike without a union. All kinds of stuff you can do without a union. But and historically, by the way, strikes came before unions. So people went on strike and then found they needed permanent organisation. So unions are essential if we want to sustain collective action over time, or over a lot of workers. So you can do a wildcat walkout in an unorganised workplace, but trying to get that to happen across lots of workplaces at the same time, you need organisation. So I do think unions are important. But as I mentioned, they often take an individualized kind of servicing approach where they're like an insurance company or a partnership rather than an organizing one. I think unions themselves are inherently sectional. And what I mean by that is they only ever represent parts of the working class. So most obviously, they tend to only organize in one or two countries. But there's also some really grim history, isn't there, of unions organising to keep women and black people out of certain occupations. We get industries and workplaces with multiple unions where unions behave really badly, not putting the collective interests of workers first, but their own kind of sectional interests ahead of each other. So we need to be aware that's kind of built into what unions are, that they're representing particular groups of workers. We see this with some of the unions taking really bad positions over things like the arms industry or fossil fuel industries, where they say, oh, got to put our members first, even if people are being genocided halfway around the world. That's not that important compared to a fairly dubious argument about protecting members' jobs. They often accept to deliver a division of labour, kind of outsourcing political issues to the Labour Party. That's clearly breaking down now, which I think is quite exciting. But we still run the risk, I think, of that political division of Labour being replicated with other parties. So rather than taking up political issues directly, using workers' collective power, outsourcing them to politicians and having a kind of client relationship between the two. And that lets both off the hook, doesn't it? So politicians claim not to interfere in industrial disputes. That's union business. Union leaders claim not to get involved in politics. That's for the politicians, and workers lose both ways. And then when we're campaigning through unions and organising through unions, we are fundamentally negotiating the terms of our oppression or exploitation. So just how exploited and oppressed we're going to be. So it kind of is still within that capitalist framework. Unions inherently accept that framework and work within it. Unions develop institutional interests. So people end up thinking about this campaign for better pay is a great way of building the union, whereas for workers, the union is a means to an end, isn't it? Of improving our lives and protecting our livelihoods and so on. So you get those institutional interests. Trying to protect the union becomes more important than trying to protect the members some of the time. And that is particularly a factor for what people refer to as a bureaucracy. Sometimes that's just bandied around as a term of abuse. I'm not using it in that way. So you get people who are paid staff of unions, but you also get, in the jargon, lay members, so people not employed by the union, who are heavily embedded in lots of committees and structures and get lots of time off work to do union business, who also are very prone to prioritise institutional interests above members' interest too. And that paid bureaucracy, obviously, it's particularly acute for them. If they're spending more time talking to government ministers and employers than they are to workers, and their lifestyle quite often is more akin to them as well. I mean, there's currently a general secretary election going on in Unison, and the package for the current general secretary is over £180,000 a year. I don't think very many members are getting close to that. It's more like the people she's bargaining against, supposedly. So you get that divergence of interest. So unions become a site of struggle themselves between members and paid officials, between left and right, and so on. I don't know if people have got experience of bumping up against any of those issues. I'm going to skip over this, but basically there's a number of different ways that people have tried to respond to that problem of the trade union bureaucracy. And the one I would advocate is what I would call a rank and file approach, which includes trying to replace bad officers with better ones and improving the rules. But fundamentally, it's about trying to build workers' capacity to act independently so that we can do things for ourselves no matter what the union officials say. And that involves working with and against officials. So that means when they're helpful, working with them, cooperating them, taking advantage of them, because to most workers, most of the time, they're seen as the official face of the union. It's helpful if they're on board. They're often gatekeepers to all kinds of resources. So that's useful to do that, but we try not to get ourselves tied to them limiting what we're able to do. So is that a hand, Albert, or I can't quite see this dazzling light? No, right. The classic statement of this is Willie Gallagher writing for the Clyde Workers' Committee back in 1915. I do think it's worth unpicking some of the words in this because when he was writing this notion of act independently meant organise a wildcat strike. Now, most of us, most of the time, aren't in a position to do that. That's quite an unusual position to be in 2025. And I think sometimes people think, oh, I like the sound of that, but I can't do it. Um, really, when we think about acting independently, to think about, well, what would be the tiny little baby steps to get us towards that? So, can workers have a little meeting and decide something without relying on the officer to approve it or to do it for them? Can they produce a leaflet themselves? Can they run a little campaign themselves? What are the little stepping stones towards that? And I think we should always be looking for ways to increase um, workers' capacity to act independently. Um, and a word on so at the height we've had like rank and file movements in Britain. I don't think it's possible to have a rank and file movement in Britain at the moment simply because there aren't the level of strikes to sustain that. But we have had in recent years quite a few examples of members organising to overturn some rotten deals that officials have tried to recommend to them. But in most cases, there's generally been inadequate organisation for workers to be able to develop alternative strategies. So we can say no, but not to be able to say we want to do this instead. Never mind to be able to actually make that happen without them. So we have a weakness of rank and file organisation. What's interesting, I think, is in the US, they've had an organization called Labour Notes since around 1980. And that has continued and grown. It's not without its problems, I should say, but they have proved that it's possible to have and build and sustain organization even through some really grim years for the Labour movement. But what they've built isn't a rank and file movement. It isn't even a rank and file organization. It's kind of a hybrid between that and what you might call a militant minority. So it hasn't got the roots really down into the rank and file that you would have if you were in the middle of a strike wave, but it's gathering together the people who are committed to that as a strategy, wherever they're at in the process of being able to deliver it. And it's played a very, very important and useful role, I think, in popularising rank and file politics and militancy within the US. It's a real challenge to try and replicate that. So I've been involved in Troublemakers at Work, which is an attempt to make very tiny baby steps towards that. But obviously, that militant minority are both a minority. There's not many of us, and generally very busy because they're busy trying to organise at work and to fight the boss, which is the main thing. I think the key elements of rank and file organisation are always going to be at industry and local level. That's where connections are strongest and can have most impact on the situation. Troublemakers is much broader. It's trying to facilitate the growth of those kind of organisations, not substitute for them. Yeah, and I'll leave it there.